This edition of MacVoices is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and 10% off your first purchase, go to squarespace.com and use the discount code MacVoices. Welcome back to MacVoices. This is the Talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, I believe this is the first appearance on MacVoices for Shelly Brisbin. She's the author of iOS Access for All, a new book about accessibility in Apple's iOS operating system. Shelly, it's great to have you on. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed that we've never been able to connect, but I know we have talked about doing an interview on this book for a long time, and it's been that long in the making. So I'm glad it's finally out and you're finally here.
Me too. It's been almost a year that I've been writing in it, so it feels amazing to be done.
So I'm going to ask you to walk us through the book, why you felt there was a need for this, and the fact that Apple does seem, at least from where I sit, to have built a lot of accessibility things into iOS. So maybe we'll start there. Sure. Is what they've built in adequate?
It is. They're always features that you want, but new features, but that's true of anything, any operating system, any piece of software. So what Apple did when they put accessibility in iOS with when the iPhone 3GS was released was quite amazing. And not just because there was nothing there and all of a sudden there was something, because I remember picking up an iPhone when I could barely use it before the 3GS came out and being really disappointed by that. But what Apple did right out of the gate was create a mature is too strong a word, but a very robust accessibility operating system, especially for blind and visually impaired people, because the VoiceOver screen reader, the VoiceOver name is familiar to Mac users of accessibility tools, came into iOS well-formed, well-imagined, and what happened very quickly was that blind people who typically have been Windows users and have then used phones that use either some sort of add-on screen reading or accessibility tools were able to pick up an iPhone out of the box, and they became Apple fans, and they became iPhone users, and when the iPad came out, they became serious users of iPads, so much so that I think it really is the preferred platform for most blind and visually impaired folks, especially blind folks who rely on VoiceOver that I'm aware of. And then as of iOS 6 and 7, additional accessibility features have made it possible for hearing impaired users and people with motor and cognitive disabilities also to get some of those same benefits. And it continues to grow, it continues to get better, but there are obviously, improvements we'd like to see. And in fact, just as everybody else has their iOS 8 wish lists going out around on the community, the disability community has wish lists as well. But there's more done right than is done wrong with accessibility on iOS.
Okay, we're going to get back to the wish list after a while, but for right now, I'm going to ask you to walk us through the book, I guess, and your approach to it and how you document. Is this a how-to book on accessibility, how to take full advantage, or does this outline all the accessibility features, or what?
It's intended to be a how-to book, and it's intended to address people all the way from beginning users to either, if not advanced users, intermediate users who want to take it one step further. And so I start out with a couple of chapters of introduction and quick start, which let you know how to turn on basically the accessibility features, what those features are, and let you get started, hit the ground running. Because a lot of people, when they take their new phones out of the box, that's what they want to do. Then I have several chapters that address the accessibility features on a disability by disability basis. So there's a VoiceOver chapter for blind users, a low vision chapter for people who have visual impairments, a chapter for people with hearing impairments, and a chapter for people with cognitive or motor disabilities. And all of the features that are relevant to those folks that are built into iOS are covered in those chapters. There's also a chapter about Siri, which I think is an amazing unsung accessibility feature that almost all iOS users can use and enjoy, and especially people with disabilities. And so those chapters drill deep and not only tell you, well, this is what VoiceOver is and this is how it works, but this is how to use VoiceOver with a Bluetooth keyboard or a Braille display. This is how to do everything from write to read to control your iOS device and move folders around, all that sort of stuff. And I do that for all those different disability categories. And then the last couple of chapters are about apps. So when I taught you how to use VoiceOver in chapter 3, I said, this is how you move something, this is how you flick, this is how you tap. But what I do in chapter 8 is I go on an app by app basis, and all the apps that are included with iOS get their own little sections. So if you're a blind user, you don't know that on the iPad, Mail has 2 columns for the layout. And so I need to tell you that, and I need to tell you how to manipulate that with VoiceOver. Same thing goes for phone. What are those buttons that appear on the grid, and how am I going to use them? And so I don't do a comprehensive description of how to use all the apps, but I do try to address from an accessibility point of view the strengths and weaknesses. When there are apps that have accessibility problems, I talk about workarounds, I talk about tips. And then the final chapter is sort of a compendium of really great apps in all categories, from productivity to games to entertainment to data management. And then there's a category for accessibility. And the first criteria for being included in that chapter is it has to be a great app. And the second criteria is that it has to be accessible for the community it's intended for. So that gives me an opportunity to talk about 100 different really great apps that'll do everything from navigate with GPS in an accessible way for a blind pedestrian, to provide stimulation for an autistic kid in an educational setting, to play an audio-only game using VoiceOver. And then there are some appendices at the end that describe VoiceOver gestures and how to use VoiceOver with a Braille display or a Bluetooth keyboard. So to answer your question in brief, it's how-to oriented, but then I also try to throw in enough information about living with your device and choosing and using apps in a way that's accessible, that hopefully users at all levels will find something in it that they'll like.
Shelly, there's so many things I want to ask here, but the fact that you wrap it up, let's go kind of in reverse order. The fact that you wrap it up with 100 apps, how do you feel the developer community has addressed the needs of accessibility? And obviously, it's a lot easier with the stuff Apple has built in, but do you find that there are a lot of apps out there that leverage that and do make it easier for the challenged user?
It's a really great question, and I think obviously it varies by developer. Some of the developers, it's not really based on the size of the developer, so some of the biggest developers out there have not done a great job. Some of the 1-person or 2-person operation developers have done extraordinary work, and a lot of that stuff has come with people in the accessibility community going to a developer and saying, hey, do you realize that your software is not accessible? Because in some cases, that's what happens. Even though Apple gives all the tools to developers, they might not either have thought that there is a need for accessibility, or they might simply have not evaluated that when they were building their software. And so some developers, Instapaper is a really great example, where the developer there listened to some blind users who really wanted, because blind users do a lot of reading on their iDevices. And so that developer listened and made that app much more accessible, and had blind beta testers who, beat on it until it was. And then there are other developers, sadly, the Microsoft Office release that happened recently, not particularly accessible. And that's unfortunate, because there are a lot of people who work in Office-only environments, Office being Microsoft Office, and would like that accessibility, availability on the iPad. And Microsoft isn't there yet. It's somewhat accessible, but it's not, from a practical point of view, nearly baked. And so it really varies a great deal. And obviously there are apps out there that are intended specifically for the accessibility community, and those folks interact on a constant basis with people in that community about how to make them accessible. So it's really hit and miss. Fortunately, there's a good community of people out there banging on apps and saying on websites, these are good apps, these are less good apps, these apps have really improved. And I'm happy to say that the accessibility community is pretty good about speaking out when things are good and bad. So it's not only just complaining, but it's actually giving praise when praise is earned. And so that's good. There's some that could do better, but it's getting better.
That's good to hear. I realize is a loaded question, but I'm going to try it anyway. Do you see any 1 or 2 features or 1 or 2 categories of accessibility that are pretty much consistently missed? In other words, is there some low-hanging fruit for developers to say, oh, I could be more accessible, so I'll start with these 2 or 3 things?
Well, it's not so much a category. Actually, some of the some of the things that are the most frustrating are the most simple, like labeling buttons for VoiceOver. So you have a menu item, you have a button on the button bar, you have a back button. It's the easiest thing in the world, or among the easiest things a developer can do, to simply label those buttons with names that make them understandable to VoiceOver. And so the developers who haven't even taken time to do that, those are the folks I want to say, that's just a matter of adding a string. That's not a great amount of work. And I'm not a developer. I can't pretend to know all the details of the things that they need to do to create robust accessibility. But things like that, where it's just really basic, and where when you flick on that app with VoiceOver on, you can instantly tell whether you're going to have a good or bad accessibility experience.
Okay, so that's something we need to encourage everybody to do, is just take those extra few minutes. And I know, to the developers out there, I know what that sounds like. Everybody just says, well, just a couple extra minutes for this or that.
Sure.
But at the same time, this is an audience that will truly appreciate it and will give you credit for it if you do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that some developers, like I say, there is ignorance out there. There are a lot of people who, even though that information is available and documented from Apple, I think there are a lot of people who haven't even really explored the accessibility of their own apps. And unless somebody tells them, they might not do so.
Shelly, to go back to Siri too, you mentioned Siri and with some praise. Do you think Siri is reliable enough? It's really interesting to hear you give it praise when so many people say, "Oh, it didn't work twice, so I stopped using it." And I don't understand that, because it always works. It could be better, of course, but it works well enough for me to actually get real work done. I would think from an accessibility standpoint, it would be a huge boon to productivity.
Yeah, and actually, there are a few things that Siri does in the VoiceOver environment that are little extras that are kind of nice. I mean, there are problems, and VoiceOver users will actually talk about, there's some pronunciation issues, and one of the things that a lot of VoiceOver users would like is a pronunciation dictionary that would help not only VoiceOver in general, but Siri specifically. But as far as just general reliability, my experience has been good. I suspect it depends a lot on the networks you're on, and maybe what part of the country you're on, whether you're in a city with good cell service and that sort of thing. So to some extent it's Siri, to some extent it's environmental. My experiences have been good. I'm not a Pollyanna person by nature, so I take seriously when people say that they have problems with it or it doesn't work for them, but that's not been my experience. And from what I hear of the community, the accessibility community, most people are far gladder it's there than they would be if not. I mean, I don't think Siri is the main source of complaints from the accessibility community, although improvement certainly could happen.
Okay, I'll bite. What are the main complaints from the accessibility community? You set me up for that.
Sure, I did. Well, let's talk low vision, my personal favorite subject. So I'm a low vision user. I've worked in the mainstream technology world all my life, but I personally am a low vision user. So when iOS 7 came out, it was a mess. So all the interface complaints that people had about iOS 7 visually were magnified, to pardon the pun, for those of us with low vision, because the contrast was a problem. All those hippy-dippy little transparencies and things that were floating around that looked pretty were huge annoyances, and in fact caused a lot of productivity to be lost. So iOS 7.1 fixed some of them, because there were a lot of low vision people who I would not be surprised if they had thrown their iPhones when OS 7 came out. And so 7.1 sort of put a Band-Aid on it and fixed, and 7.1.1 as well. And I said at the time, 7.1 was probably the first release of iOS I'd ever seen that was primarily a low vision release, and I didn't expect to ever see that again, because there were 4 or 5 new things that were added in 7.1, frankly, to fix stuff that was broken in 7.0. So again, it was all about contrast. It was about font use. It was about the fact that keyboards did not contrast with the letters on the keyboards, and it was a mess. So there's still issues with that. I maintain that Apple can't be done with contrast-related accessibility tweaks. And there's some people that say that a complete redesign is what's needed, because what they're doing now is having toggle switches where you can increase transparency or reduce white point or darken colors, or button shapes, which highlights text buttons and puts underlines under them. but it really does kind of look a little half-baked, and it looks like they kind of got caught out of, well, we better make it a little bit better until we can do something more substantive. So that's the biggest first one, and obviously, from my point of view, the most important ones.
Shelly, you may be the first person that's ever been on the show that used the phrase hippy dippy. I'm
glad about that.
I kind of like that. It is interesting. I do sometimes wonder, for a lot of people, iOS 7 represented a big step forward in design, but there were definitely places, even as a normal sighted user, or someone without the visual challenges, that just things didn't make sense. I understand that they may have looked great, but they didn't function well, and I think a lot of that's been reversed. But I'm with you. I think there's still a few places that we could get back to having things a little more usable and maybe not quite as pretty.
Well, one nice thing with skeuomorphism was that if you had trouble sort of figuring out where you were from a visual point of view, you had a frame of reference. If a calendar looked like a wall calendar, then you could kind of get back to where you needed to be in order to be oriented, if that makes any sense. And calendar is one of those where they actually made some improvements, but where there's still something sort of amorphous about the way that app looks that I think is difficult for some people to use. And then you add in, and then something like weather, where you have design trumping functionality, or terms of ease of use, and in terms of being able to actually read those little bitty buttons while the clouds are rolling by in the background. And so design aesthetics are kind of are lost on a lot of us who are just trying to get our work done and figure out what the temperature is going to be for the rest of the day.
So I've never really thought about that. Was the loss or the abandonment of skeuomorphism a step backward for the accessibility community?
I think that it could have been a lot worse. I think that, and I use calendar as a specific example where it was a problem, and I think still is to some extent. And I say that as somebody who was trying to document it and trying to write about it. I never even really thought about it, because I could grok calendar, I could get through it. But when I started trying to explain in words how calendar looked visually and how you navigated through it with or without voiceover, I found that I was having trouble finding frames of reference. I think it's better than it was, and I also think there's a tendency to just sort of get mad about something that turns out not to be as bad as it looked initially, if that makes any sense.
Perfectly.
I think it's too late to go back. They've decided that skeuomorphism is not what they want to do, and it's too late to be upset about it. But I unfortunately think, as I said, that some of the design fixes that they've made have harmed the overall look of design in order to sort of keep the accessibility community from losing its mind completely. And I think that just has to be something that's going to evolve, and I'm looking forward to that happening.
Shelly, this may be sensitive, but I'm going to shoot for it anyway. Can you have a good accessibility design with good design for the normally sighted people? Or
you should be able to. I think you can. I think, and the interesting thing about it is that when a new design comes out, the old design looks super old. So if I have a first generation iPad over here, because I have a stand that fits it and I like it and it just sits here. And so it runs iOS 5. And that feels so incredibly old. But I read an article the other day where somebody was writing about some of the visual changes in OS 7. And he was talking about not so much the skeuomorphism, but things like textured buttons. And he was saying, from an accessibility point of view, those are really helpful and useful. And he was absolutely right. But it's hard for me to look at the older design and not feel like almost everybody else does. Oh, well, that's old. That's what Apple used to do. Your brain seeks the new and appreciates the new and looks at the old and goes, well, that looks sort of clunky. It didn't look clunky when that design first came out. So I guess the answer is I didn't think that design was aesthetically unpleasing until something new came out. So that cycle, I guess, can be repeated. I think the problem is that for those who maybe it's like when you're designing from the 30,000 foot point of view, pointing out accessibility issues in that design is a little harder for the people at that level to grok than for the guys and gals who are actually having to code it down below, which is why you get updates like 7.1 that sort of go, well, if I highlight the back button or if I put underlines on text buttons, will that be easier for you? And they're trying, but they're not creating a cohesive design. What they're doing is fixing problems. And so I think the answer to your question is that it can happen, but that the accessibility component has to be fit somewhere in between the down on the drawing board level and the 30,000 foot level. And I'm not sure how you do that because that's not my business. That's not what I do. But I'd like to see it happen at a far earlier point. Otherwise, you get design tweaks that look like just that.
I'm wondering if there's a divergence at some point where you say, okay, over here you're going to go down one path, over here you're going to go down the other, and we're going to optimize each path for their targeted users. And I can't think of a good example except maybe to say, over here we're going to use color, over here we're just going to use black and white, and that's going to be it. That's going to be the way that we're going to differentiate the two, and try to address the accessibility needs down one path while the aesthetic needs of the rest of the audience down the other.
Well, the hard part about that is, speaking specifically about low vision, not every low vision person has the same needs, whereas color, I have some color blindness issues, and so I don't want to be cued with color. There are a lot of people for whom color is absolutely essential. And so you sort of get to you tear your hair out. Well, what can I do that will address all audiences? And some of my friends in the accessibility community probably disagree with me about this. I think we should all be on one path, and that the accessibility features should be customizable enough so that I can make the best of what's out there, so that the overall design should not be so stylized that you have to break it in order to make it accessible to me. But it's not wrong to create accessibility features that allow me to do what I need to do, that if you turn them on would make it difficult for you to use it. And the disagreement comes in that I think there are some people in the accessibility community who want fewer settings in accessibility and more less design overall. And Apple is a design-oriented company, and I guess if you're going to get in the boat with Apple, you're going to have to make those compromises. I would rather, I've said this when 7.1 came out, my idea for low vision accessibility would be that you'd have a series of settings that you could tweak for your own uses, and that could be saved in a file on iCloud or something, or as a plist or something, and that I could carry it to my device and I could use it the way I want to use it, and my mother, who has macular degeneration, could use it in a completely different way, and that, essentially script something, but that doesn't have to obviate the design goals of Apple for a larger audience.
Okay, so again, a couple things you said there I definitely want to follow up on. You talked about getting in the boat with Apple. How does Apple stack up against, say, Android or some of the other competitors out there? And if you even want to go to the desktop OS, that's okay, but I'd like to know your evaluation as someone who uses these features. Are they number one, number two, good, bad, indifferent?
On the visual accessibility side, and especially with VoiceOver as a screen reader, Apple still is a leader of the pack as far as mobile OS. Android is improving, and their TalkBack screen reader, there are, just as there are in the mainstream community, in the accessibility community, there are Apple versus Android arguments. And there's nothing more fun than to listen to Apple versus Android arguments on an accessibility podcast, and I've done so many times. I think Apple is still winning. I think their lead is less, not because of what they haven't done, but because Android is picking up. The problem with Android is that because of the different versions of the Android OS that are out there in different devices, your experience is not as consistent, and you can't reliably pick up any Android device and know what you're getting as far as accessibility. So Apple leads in that sense. If you just want it to work and you just want accessibility, then this is mostly to do with vision. I can't really speak to some of the details of stuff like motor disability. For example, Apple has this great thing called switch control, where you actually can physically control your device with a switch. That's new in iOS 7, and I really don't know much about where those kinds of features are in the Android world. I also know that because of the iPad's prevalence in schools, a lot of accessibility for cognitive disabilities like autism and other kinds of disabilities where an educator needs to customize an interface. The iPad is already in the schools, and so the iPad has a high level of adherence. And I think that's going to continue to be the case for a while, just because of that kind of inertia, and also the iPad environment is richer and more consistent than the Android one. I don't think Windows Phone is even in the conversation. I think it's an Android versus Apple race, and that the question really is, if you're trying to decide between Apple and Android as a user, the question, it's kind of funny because the Android question, it's not like the Windows versus Mac question, where Windows was sort of the business stolid solution and Apple was for people who had a little more desire for creativity. Android is the more adventurous path, and if you're a geek and if you might want to root your device, Android is probably where you're going to go. But for just workaday accessibility, at the moment, Apple is still leading.
You said Windows Phone's not even in the conversation. Is that because of the lack of market share, or is it because of the lack of accessibility features?
There really aren't that many accessibility features on Windows Phone. There's not like a robust screen reader the way VoiceOver or TalkBack exists. And I don't know about the degree to which they're supporting external devices like hearing aids and such. But it's really pretty much Apple and Android at this point.
Okay, well, that's good, and it's good. Obviously, I'm a little biased. It's good to know that Apple's winning.
Yes.
This may be an obvious question, especially when it comes to low vision and that kind of thing. But is the iPhone and the iPad equal in their accessibility beyond obviously the obvious larger screen? Or are there particular things that make one better suited for someone with an accessibility issue?
It's a real good question. And it's kind of funny to me because I always assumed, and again, low vision point of view, I always assumed that the iPad is going to be desirable because you've got more screen real estate, whether that means that you zoom in or whether it just means that you can, you have more screen real estate. There are an awful lot of people who they have to choose one device. And they choose an iPhone because they want the accessibility provided by the iPhone's GPS. So they want to use it for navigation, whether they be on public transit or whether they be as a pedestrian. Or if they're low vision, they want to magnify a restaurant menu, or they want to read a street sign by using the camera and taking a picture of it or something like that. So if people have to choose one device, I think the iPhone is probably what they pick. As far as just straight up accessibility of iOS, they're pretty equal. I will say that you face trade-offs on a thing like the iPad mini, where because the screen because it renders text somewhat smaller from a low vision point of view, even though the iPad mini is sort of easier to hold and manipulate than a full-size iPad, it can be sometimes a struggle to read text. So if you want to do a lot of reading, a full-size iPad probably is going to be a better deal. But if you do what I do, which is hold what I'm reading physically close to my face, an iPad mini is an awful lot easier to hold than a big iPad. So it's a series of trade-offs, and I think there are quirks. Like the iPad has a few voiceover-related quirks that have to do with the use of multiple columns in the interface, and the App Store pop-up boxes have a few little weird quirks. But that really is the level of the issue is quirks rather than an accessibility limitation.
This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and 10% off your first purchase, go to squarespace.com and use the discount code MacVoices. I was talking about Squarespace the other day with a friend who uses Windows. Yes, I have some of those, and it struck me that using Squarespace to build your website is a lot like helping someone transition from Windows to the Mac. Everything is so easy, they can't believe it, and they keep trying to make it harder than it is. And that's exactly the way Squarespace works. Easier than you think it can possibly be. Everything is so visual, right there on the screen, ready for you to click, drag, select, or pick an icon or two. I found that out myself when I went looking for this option or that, and realized that I was making it much harder than it was because of my experience with other website building software. When I contacted Squarespace support, they pointed me in the right direction, and that's when I realized just how intuitive it was to build the website I was looking for. Oh, and that support was fast, pleasant to deal with, and didn't laugh at me. Maybe they should have, because the setting I was looking for was right there in front of my nose. But they didn't. Kudos to them, shame on me. You can have that same experience by going to squarespace.com and signing up for their 14-day, no commitment, no credit card required trial. Dive in and have fun building your first website, because it is fun. Then, when you decide to make your site yours, use the offer code MacVoices to take 10% off your first purchase of any server level from Squarespace. From there on, it will be smooth sailing, and they won't laugh at you if you miss something obvious. That's professionalism. Squarespace, everything you need to create an exceptional website. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this edition of MacVoices. Some of these answers are surprising to me. I guess I'm learning as we go here, because what would seem to be an obvious answer in some areas is not the obvious answer at all, and I'm thinking specifically about the iPhone versus iPad question. What you said makes perfect sense about an iPad mini, but I would have thought, okay, well, iPhone, then the iPad mini, then the iPad in that order, but I very much see your point.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I know people who carry iPhones who are blind, and they say to me, well, I'm writing on the iPhone, I'm doing my email, or I'm reading a book or something like that. And I'm thinking, well, obviously you could have an external keyboard, but if you're carrying the iPhone, that sort of defeats the purpose. And then they whip out these little tiny keyboards that are just, fit in the palm of your hand, and that's what they carry. And, everybody creates the system that's comfortable for them. And again, I think a lot of it is about, well, I've chosen, this is the one device I'm going to have. And I got the iPad mini expressly because it was physically easier to hold close to my face when I wanted to read. I bought that thing as a reading device and have since discovered that the small size of the text and the fact that I don't really want to zoom in on the screen and have only that access to a small area of the screen, it's making me think my next iPad's going to be a big one, even though it's trade-offs. It's the same kinds of decisions that anybody has to make. We just might have to think about them slightly more carefully and from a different perspective. But it's, everybody does it on one level.
Well, and it's educational for those of us that don't have the accessibility challenges to learn a little bit about how to think about this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we can do it in, the 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes we're going to be together, but it certainly at least makes me ask some of the questions.
Sure. Well, it's good to be able to talk about it because I think that's the sort of lack of, I think people assume one of two things about accessibility, either that it is perfect and awesome and I'm glad you guys have your stuff taken care of, I don't have to worry about that, or that how in the world can anybody possibly use an iDevice, especially an iDevice, because Steve Jobs wouldn't even let us have any buttons and it's just a flat piece of glass. And it's kind of fun to be able to there's a huge middle ground and there's some divergence of opinion about this stuff, but really it's a lot more, the basic message and like why I started writing this book and why I started talking about this was there's so much more texture to this topic than I think most people in the mainstream community are aware of. And so when I started trying to explain that, I ended up writing a several hundred-page book.
And let's circle back to the book. We got off on accessibility challenges and issues, and I'm curious. So you took a year to write this book. How is this book published? Are you doing it, or are you working with a publisher?
I'm publishing it myself. I've written books in the past with paper book publishers back in the day, years ago, and it just seemed like, first of all, it was clear to me, obviously, that it was obvious to me that the ebook book format made sense, not only because we don't publish as many paper books anymore, but from an accessibility point of view, it made it possible for me to make it completely accessible to anybody who could use an iDevice, so that was a duh. And then I decided to publish it myself rather than go with a publisher because I actually found that publishers weren't as familiar with the accessibility community and the potential, even though it's quite well documented that an awful lot of blind and visually impaired folks, specifically a lot of people with disabilities, are using iDevices, it's really hard for publishers to figure out what that market is. And so it made sense for me to just do it on my own. And so I'm having conversations like this and getting the word out and talking to the accessibility community. And that's another interesting thing about it, because when I decided to publish it myself, I realized that a lot of what I was going to have to do was go to the accessibility community and become better known with those people, those folks, my friends now that I was before. And that also taught me a lot of what I needed to know about attitudes, about what was and what wasn't working in iOS. And it made me listen more. It made me much more responsive to what other people out there were experiencing than just, me with my iPad mini and the small text. So I learned a lot from the process, and that's how that came to be.
So you're publishing this yourself. How are you making it available?
Right now it's an EPUB format, which makes it compatible with iBooks as well as any other EPUB-friendly reader. And you go to my website and purchase it, and then a download is then made available. You can put that in your Dropbox, or you can download it directly to your device or to your computer, and then it will open up in iBooks. I am going to do a PDF version, and ironically, I guess the reason that version isn't out yet is that I still have some accessible tagging. I have learned so much about EPUB and PDF accessibility over the course of this process. It's ridiculous, and I've spent a lot of time in HTML as well, so I know more about EPUB than I ever thought I would.
Can you give us the 30-second rundown on accessibility tagging, because that's not a phrase I've heard before?
Oh, it's in my world. I hear it every day. Well, in any document, accessibility tagging first means that you have to be able to access the format of the document. So I want to know what the headings are. I want to know heading level 1, heading level 2, so that I can orient myself in the book if I'm using a screen reader. The other thing I want to do is make sure that all of the images or illustrations, anything that's visual, has the equivalent of an alt tag. So I either have an alt tag that says this is a picture of an iPhone, or what I typically did was I would take my figure caption and put that in the alt tag. So that meant that I could have figures that were accessible. So if you look in Chapter 4, which is about low vision accessibility, you will see comparison images of the iPhone screen with and without accessibility features enabled. And so those were really valuable images, but obviously if you're blind, you can't see them. So I had to tag all the images. I had to, again, make sure the headings and the table of contents was accessible from a screen reader point of view, because if you're reading a screen reader, it's really easy to get lost in a book, any kind of publication that doesn't have some sort of tagging to help orient you in the context of what you're reading. And so in PDF, that's especially a challenge, because usually you have to go into existing PDFs, and there are whole standards about accessibility tagging in various formats. And the big challenge for people who have existing PDFs is going in and hacking around and figuring out a way to make that tagging accessible. And so that's been my challenge. I've been a lot of tagging the past few weeks.
So your next book will be about tagging.
If not a book, at least a presentation. I'll probably do a presentation about rolling your own EPUB, because I built this thing in Pages and then I exported it out to EPUB. But there was a lot of customization that had to be done, not just for accessibility, but just to make the EPUBs validate. So I think probably not my next book, because actually there are a couple people out there who have written that book and done it quite well. But I probably will make a presentation at a conference somewhere talking about rolling your own EPUB, even though you have Pages as a visual beginning place.
You say to go to the website to purchase it. So first of all, let's make sure we get that in. The website is iosaccessbook.com. And there are links. There's a couple of interesting things. If you're not sure you want to buy the book or you need the book, there is a sample chapter available. It happens to be the Siri chapter, and I thought that's the most accessible to the most people. So you learn all about how to use Siri from an accessibility point of view, but there's also a whole lot of Siri commands in there, and that's available in EPUB and PDF format. And then the whole table of contents is there, as well as just an explanation of who I am and what I'm about. And then you can buy the book in EPUB format. I have a mailing list, and all I do on that mailing list is let you know about updates. So if you want to wait for the PDF version, you can join the mailing list, and I will tell you when it comes out. Perfect. And how much is the book?
The book is $20.
Okay.
$20 US.
Okay, that's good. I'll make sure that obviously there are links in the show notes to everything here to make it a little easier for everybody to find. But if it's something you need, it's something you're interested in. Maybe if it's just something as a developer that you want to kind of get up to speed from an accessibility standpoint, this would be a great way to go about it, to understand it from the other side, from the user side.
Yeah, I think developers, I actually initially had contemplated doing a chapter, sort of the beginning accessibility for developers, and I just thought, well, that's kind of out of the scope of what I'm doing. Hopefully what a developer would get from reading it, particularly the chapter 8 that concerns apps, is just little sort of esoteric things about how one might use an app given an accessibility challenge that you might not think of. If I can get a developer or somebody else in the mainstream community go, wow, I never thought about that, then I've accomplished something.
We started talking about iOS and accessibility, and I think somewhere in there we said, your wish list for iOS 8. So how about if we wrap up with what would be your wish list for iOS 8 from an accessibility standpoint?
Well, first and foremost, just some bug fixes, some consistency. VoiceOver has, well, all right. VoiceOver, there are a few apps that could, even Apple's apps, that could stand a little better VoiceOver support. My big one, and this is one nobody talks about, and it really astonishes me, and this is not even something that Apple has complete control of, but Newsstand is a great resource. The trouble is that most periodicals in Newsstand are not accessible. That's not Apple's fault, because Apple builds this container and people put their content in Newsstand, but Apple hasn't really encouraged people to make their content accessible, and it can be made accessible. And I'm happy to say that there are a few publications that have done a great job. The New York Times, Macworld Magazine, a magazine called The Magazine, all have very accessible Newsstand content. There are other magazines that it's completely inaccessible. And I really have to lay this one at Apple's feet in the sense that I'm not aware of any promotion they've done of accessibility within Newsstand. So I don't even know that that's an iOS 8 thing, but it's just a big accessibility hole, because I think a lot of people would really benefit from having access to Newsstand. Another one, I guess, like I say, my whole low vision accessibility, we talked about a lot of it, but I'd like some sort of more robust ability to, if you're going to have a high design, high stylized interface, some sort of robust ability to control accessibility from a low vision point of view and get beyond the 3 toggle switches and, help me as a user create an overlay or a macro or something that allows me to use the system as well as somebody who doesn't have that disability. I think just advances in things that are already there. Hearing aid support has been in iOS for a while, but there aren't a lot of hearing aids that actually have come to market yet that support it. I guess this isn't an Apple thing, is it? That's more on the developers working with Apple, the hardware manufacturers. Then some more switch control is a great feature that allows people who have motor disabilities to control an iOS device. I think that interface is a little hard to grok for a lot of people. It was certainly hard for me to grok when I was writing it, and I think some sort of streamlining of that interface would be kind of nice. And then VoiceOver stuff, just in the category of there are bugs and there are inconsistencies in the way it's implemented. I don't have any big picture feature for that. There are some people out there who have thought about this a little bit more than I have, and there's a hashtag, which I can't remember right now, but there is a lot of discussion, and there are actually a couple of great blog posts that have collected some of the iOS 8 accessibility wish lists, and I'm probably not doing them justice.
Well, that's a pretty good list to get started for iOS 8 and maybe beyond.
Yep, it won't all happen at once, but that's what makes it fun. That means I get to write another edition of the book. So I'm sure I will. I'm saving the files.
Well, when you're not writing this particular book, because now it's finished finally, although you've still got some other versions to come out, where else can people find you? What else are you doing?
Well, I'm just a podcast gadfly, basically. No, I do some technical writing here and there. I'm actually, because of this process, probably going to do more with accessibility and usability testing. You can find me on Twitter. Shelly is my username, Shelly, and I'm usually there holding forth. If you'd like to hire me to write something about iOS accessibility, you can find me there as well.
I envision a new career as an accessibility consultant, Shelly.
It could happen. There are a lot of people who do that work, and I've actually I had some fun. I did some consulting work with a friend of mine who has a connection in a local school district, and she was teaching teachers who work with kids who have blindness and low vision, and their school district has disallowed iOS. In other words, they've just opted for the Android platform. Their IT people said we don't want to fool with it, which is kind of an unusual situation. And the teachers are like, well, that's okay, except that kids bring iPads to school. Their families have iPads. And so they need to know enough about how to enable accessibility so that those kids who have iPads can actually get some benefit when they're doing their homework or when they're at home. And it was really interesting to work with all these 50-something ladies who don't really care about Apple or Android. They would just like to be able to help their kids unlock the doors of accessibility. And so that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me that, you spend all this time approaching this as a geek, and there are a lot of people who just would kind of like to know how to turn it on.
I think that's the point. There's a lesson there that goes way beyond accessibility, but
Yep.
we won't go down that path this time. Well, Shelly, it's great to have you. I'm sorry it's taken this long to get you on the show, but I'm glad that you got here for this particular subject, and we have to do it again soon.
It was a pleasure.
I'm sure there's so much more that I really should ask that I don't have enough experience to ask, so we'll get there.
Well, it was great to be here, and I'm always happy to shine a light on this topic, and I hope that you'll let me come talk about accessibility maybe when iOS 8 comes out.
Count on it. Well, I think we'll be doing it before then.
Great.
I will be in touch.
All right. Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thank you. Folks, Shelly Brisbin, I want to make sure I get it right, iOS Access for All. Go check it out if you are a developer and need some accessibility advice. Shelly's Twitter handle is right there, too. Go get her. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, app.net, Google+, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date with all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at MacVoices.com/newsletter. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at BackbeatMedia.com.